Memory is not a reliable narrator when it comes to your own failures. I've looked for it the moment it started. The exact point where I decided that feeling things was a liability. That the version of me who didn't need anyone was the version worth keeping. And I can't find it. And it's not even because it doesn't exist, though, but because the filter was already running by the time I thought to look. The construction happened inside the blind spot. That's the thing about the stories we tell about ourselves, is that the editing is invisible. And you only notice the cut when something forces the footage back in front of you. And by that point, you've already been living inside someone else's edit for years. Someone else being you. An earlier, more frightened version of you, who made the decision in the dark and then forgot he made it. That's how coping mechanisms become personalities. That's exactly how you can spend years believing you're seeing reality clearly when what you're actually seeing is a version of reality organized around protecting a wound. I've been playing a lot of Red Redemption 2 recently, so let me use Arthur Morgan as an analogy for all of this. Arthur Morgan doesn't know when he stopped trusting people either. You play him across the whole game, and the distance is just there, baked into every interaction. So consistent that you stop noticing the same way you stop noticing your own. He follows Dutch off a cliff while keeping him at arm's length. He documents landscapes carefully in his journal, and he never once writes down what any of it costs him. The filter doesn't announce itself. It just becomes the texture of how a person moves through the world. Aldous Huxley wrote that the human mind is equipped with something he called the reducing valve. The idea, borrowed partially from William James, is that consciousness is capable of receiving vastly more than it normally processes. More raw experience than you could ever function inside it without going completely batshit insane. So the brain narrows the aperture. It filters. It turns an impossible flood of information into a manageable stream you can actually live inside. That's the neutral version. The one that keeps you from dissolving into every sensation every second of the day. But Huxley's deeper argument is that the valve doesn't just filter perception, it filters the self. I mean, you can train it. You can train it. You can run the aperture down so far that entire categories of experience stop getting through. And the training is so gradual, so indistinguishable from just getting older and smarter about how the world works, that by the time you notice the filter is in place, you've already been living inside it for years. And you've started calling it character. That distinction between what the brain does automatically and what a person does deliberately is where this gets personal. I already said this multiple times and I will keep saying it. Emotional shutdown looks like strength. I mean, from the outside they wear the same clothes, and sometimes from the inside they feel identical too. We built an entire mythology around the person who's been hurt enough that nothing reaches him anymore. And we present that person as the destination, as what you're supposed to become if you survive enough. It's bullshit. That's complete bullshit. And I say that as someone who believed it completely, to the point it almost cost me my own life. Understand that the self-help industry is fundamentally in the business of selling you a ladder out of the hole, rather than a torch to see what's actually in it. And the culture around males' emotional suppression is even worse. They don't even sell you the ladder. They just tell you the hole is where you're supposed to live and call it discipline. Look, I loved deeply. Believe me, I loved deeply. And I got my heart broken. I loved deeply, and that love got used against me. Not once, not twice. This happened enough times that the version of me who needed people started looking like a fucking liability. So, in my point of view, emotions were a weak point. Attachment was a vulnerability someone would eventually exploit. So I closed the valve down. I tightened the aperture. I started performing a version of myself who didn't require anything from anyone. And I performed it consistently enough that the performance stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like a face. Ronald Lang was a Scottish psychiatrist who spent a lot of time studying exactly this kind of eternal splitting. He called it the false self system. His argument was that when the real self feels too exposed, too vulnerable to survive contact with the world as it actually is, a person constructs an alternative self to interface with reality on their behalf. The false self handles everything. It goes to work, maintains relationships, performs competence and indifference in whatever combination the situation requires, and the real self retreats somewhere further behind the performance, watching, safe, untouchable, but slowly starving. What Lang understood that most psychology misses is that the false self isn't a lie exactly. It's a survival mechanism that outlived the emergency that produced it. It made complete sense at the time. The problem is that it doesn't know when to stop. It keeps running the same protection protocol long after the original threat has passed. Because the whole point of the false self is that it operates you. It doesn't really consult you. That's Huxley's reducing valve as a personal project. I thought this was my brain filtering reality to prevent overload. But what I was actually doing was turning into a person deliberately narrowing what he's willing to feel in order to avoid a specific kind of pain. And the logic is convincing. I mean, if the signal can't get in, then it can't hurt you. Except that's not what it happens. That's never what happens. I performed not giving a shit for so long that I started attracting exactly the kind of situations I'd built the filter to avoid. Different faces, different places, same rooms and same dynamics. And the same inevitable outcomes. I kept arriving at the same wreckage, genuinely confused about how I kept ending up here when I'd been so fucking careful. I spent years trying to avoid exactly this. So why the fuck did I keep ending up here? That confusion, that genuine bafflement at my own recurring disasters is the clearest sign I can point to that the filter was running the show rather than me. I wasn't choosing. I was being selected for. There's a mechanic in Red Dead Redemption 2, which is Arthur's Journal. It updates automatically. After missions, after discoveries, after moments the game decides were important enough to remember, after Arthur studies animals. Arthur writes whether you think about it or not. And what interests me isn't just what gets recorded, it's what the recording reveals about the person doing the recording. For example, a legendary animal gets 2 full pages. An entire human encounter gets a few lines. The hierarchy of attention is right there on the page. And that hierarchy isn't neutral. It's a portrait of a filter operating in real time. deciding what matters and what doesn't, mostly without being asked. Before I go further into what the journal does mechanically, I want to stay with the act of journaling itself for a moment because I think most people misunderstand what it actually does to a human being. Journaling is a very powerful thing to do, and for some people, especially me, it's also a very difficult thing to do. Because of what happens inside a person when they sit down and try to put language to something they've been carrying without words. When something painful happens and you don't write it, don't speak about it, it doesn't disappear. It stays as ambient pressure, a weight you carry without knowing exactly what you're carrying, still operating without language. And the longer it goes unnamed, the more it starts to feel like just the texture of being you, rather than something specific that happened that you never fully processed. The moment you put language to it, something changes. Anyone who's tried to write honestly about something that genuinely hurt them knows the frustration of watching words land smaller than the thing they're reaching for. But the act of reaching forces the experience to take a shape it didn't have before. James Pennebaker, this guy, he was a psychologist that he used to study expressive writing. He found out that people who wrote about difficult experiences showed measurably lower cortisol levels and stronger immune system. The body was literally less burdened when the mind had been forced to articulate what it was holding. And here's what Pennebaker also found. People who shifted perspective over time, who gradually reframed the account rather than just repeating it, showed the most benefit. The ones who wrote the same story the same way every time showed almost none. Which means you can fill notebooks, you can write thousands of words across years and never actually move an inch. If the filter doesn't change, the story doesn't change either. You may feel like you're examining the wound, but truth is, you're just tracing the outline of it over and over again, calling repetition healing. And here's something else about journaling that it's extremely important, which is what happens when you go back and read what you wrote years ago. Because the person reading the entry is never quite the same person who wrote it. And sometimes the gap between them is the most honest thing the journal ever produces. You read something you wrote years ago and you can see the filter that was running then from the outside. The story you were telling yourself so consistently, you'd stop noticing it was a story. You couldn't see it from the inside at that time. Now you can. The journal becomes an archaeological record of who the filter was quietly making you into. While you were busy thinking, you were just writing down what happened. That's where Arthur comes back in. His honor level changes the way journal entries are delivered. The same words are on the page, the same words stay exactly the same, but the voice reading them out loud in cutscenes shifts depending on who you've been playing him as. So it's basically same entry, same page, different Arthur Morgan. And suddenly, the exact same words feel colder or warmer, depending on where his honor sits. The event didn't change. The interpretation layer running on top of it did. Which means the journal isn't a document of what happened. It's a document of what the current version of Arthur was capable of receiving about what happened. And the current version of Arthur was built by every choice made before he sat down to write. The filter decides what you're capable of seeing in what happened, what language you can reach for when you try to describe it, and therefore what story you're capable of telling about your own life. Built slowly, choice by choice, year by year, mostly in the goddamn dark, long before you ever sat down to tell yourself the story. The journal is honest. The page is honest, but the person reading it back to themselves isn't always. And neither are we. The cruelest thing about a filter built to prevent pain is that it doesn't filter randomly. It filters according to the story it's trying to protect. Which means if the story is people will use what you give them against you, the filter starts selecting for evidence that confirms exactly that. You stop noticing the moments that don't fit. You don't register the people who don't behave that way because they don't activate the pattern. They slide past unregistered while every confirming instance gets cataloged with perfect clarity. The threat model keeps being validated. You take that as evidence you were right to build the filter in the first place. The selection gets narrower. The validation arrives faster. Until you're living inside what feels like empirical proof of something that was always just a story you decided to believe when you were hurt and didn't yet know what else to do. I know that might sound dramatic, but I watched it happen in my own life. I watched myself repeat the same pattern with enough variation in the surface details that it kept feeling like different situations. And then I'd arrive at the same point in each one and feel genuinely surprised. The specific surprise of a man who has walked into the same fucking wall 17 times and keeps being astonished by the wall. At some point you have to ask yourself seriously, is this bad luck or is something selecting? Because at the level where the filter operates, avoidance and obsession are the same fucking motion pointed in opposite directions. Arthur's honor system is the closest thing in gaming I found to this made visible. It doesn't call him good or evil. It tracks the cumulative weight of choices made under pressure and shows you the shape of what's been building. High honor means the pattern has been moving in one direction. Low honor means the filter has been selecting for a version of yourself who you've been enacting largely without examining it. The game just holds up the aggregate. Here's what you've been doing. Here's the person you've been becoming without necessarily choosing to. And most people in real life never get that mirror held up until something breaks badly enough that the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. I want to be precise about what the filter actually cost me. Because this isn't an abstraction, and I'm tired of talking about it in ways that let everyone, including me, off the hook. The numbing escalated. That's what happens when you close the valve down far enough for long enough. The pressure doesn't disappear, it accumulates. And you need more aggressive numbing to maintain the same level of not feeling. Substances or situations, versions of life that kept the volume loud enough that nothing quieter could get through. And the aggressive numbing has its own gravity, its own way of making decisions on your behalf while you're busy convincing yourself you're the one making them. The places it took me nearly cost me everything. It cost me my freedom, my pride. It almost cost me my own life. The distance between this filter is philosophically interesting and this filter nearly killed me is the entire point of what we're talking about. This isn't abstract. This is what the mechanism actually does when you let it run long enough without examining it. And there are parts of that story that I'm going to leave in the shadow. Partially because other people exist inside those memories, and partially because the details would just pull attention toward the wreckage instead of the mechanism that produced it. Some things don't have some things don't stop having consequences just because enough time has passed. And the internet has a way of turning details into verdicts. And frankly, the details aren't what matter here. Anyway, The shape of it is this. I built a filter to protect myself from being hurt by the world, and it navigated me directly into the worst damage I ever experienced, just through a door I hadn't thought to guard. The filter selected for it. That's what I couldn't see from inside it. That's what makes the mechanism so unsettling. It's self-concealing by design. The thing that's running your life is the very thing you're least capable of examining, because examining it requires the perceptual openness it was built to prevent. And I'll tell you something else. I still feel the pull sometimes. On bad days. That tingly sensation of wanting to go full on hardcore mode. Become again the version of me that doesn't need and doesn't feel and handles everything with a performance of indifference so consistent it almost convinces even me. I would be lying if I said that feeling doesn't come back. I'm not a ticking bomb. I'm not standing on the edge of anything. But I would be dishonest with you if I pretended that the old architecture just dissolves just because you understand it. Understanding the cage doesn't automatically open the door. Sometimes you understand it completely and still feel the pull of the lock. That's the part nobody wants to admit, because it doesn't fit the arc of the story we prefer to tell about growth. The one where insight produces transformation, and transformation is permanent, and you reach a point where the old patterns stop mattering. That story is comfortable. It's also mostly fictional. What actually happens is you carry it. And on good days, the carrying is so easy you forget it's there. And on bad days, it's heavy enough that you have to be honest with yourself about what you're holding and making a deliberate choice about whether to put it back on or not. That's it. That's the whole thing. There's no version where it doesn't weigh anything. There's only the difference between carrying it consciously and letting it carry you. Look, let me ask you something. If the filter eventually becomes your identity, if the false self runs long enough that you stop feeling the difference between the performance and the person, then who the fuck are you when it opens? This is not a rhetorical question. This is a genuine one. This is a genuine question. Because the comfortable answer is lengths. The real self was always there, waiting behind the false one, patient and intact, just needing the walls to come down. And maybe that's true, but I'm not sure I believed it completely. And I think this video would be dishonest if I pretended I did. Because when the filter opened for me, what I found behind it wasn't some pristine version of myself that the performance had been hiding. What I found was someone who didn't know how to move through the world without the armor on. Someone who'd been using the filter for so long that basic navigation felt impossible without it. The filter wasn't covering the self. In a lot of ways, it had become the self. And the question of who you are without it isn't answered by removing it. It's the thing you spend years slowly figuring out in the space the removal leaves behind. That's where the honest version of this ends up. The thing Huxley believed is that the filter doesn't open through decision. You can't choose your way to a wider aperture. You can't read the right book and find the right framework. You can't decide to perceive more and have that decision be sufficient. I tried that too. And it has the same failure mode as every other intellectual solution to an emotional problem. It works perfectly in theory, but it's useless in the place where you actually live. What actually happened for me was something closer to running out of road. There's a specific physical quality to that moment that I want to try to describe accurately, because the philosophical version of it always sounds cleaner than it actually is. It felt like standing in the room where all the furniture had been removed. The kind of emptiness where you suddenly realize that the furniture was the only thing making the room intelligible. And without it, you can't remember what the room was for. Cold, slightly vertiginous. The strategies were gone. The numbing had stopped working. The performance had no audience left, including me. And in that stripped down space, with nothing left to manage and nothing left to maintain, something that had been running underneath the whole time became briefly audible. The signal, coming through at the volume I hadn't allowed before, because I'd finally run out of things to drown it with. The second image is less poetic than the first, but more accurate because of it. Something closer to system failure. The moment a machine keeps running after the operator has stopped giving it commands. Everything still technically works. I mean, you're still moving, still functioning at the surface level that the world requires. But the control layer has dropped out of the loop. And what's left is just a continuation without supervision. I remember walking through a city at night during that period and noticing that nothing was being supervised anymore. Not my thoughts, not even the meaning of what I was looking at. Everything was still happening, just without the filter deciding in real time what it was supposed to mean. And in that quiet, the simplest things started reappearing. Cold air, footsteps on pavement, the sound of my own breathing. Input that had always been there, finally getting through. Huxley spent the later part of his life trying to understand what that signal actually was. And his answer moved me in directions I'm not going to follow him into here. But the diagnostic part, the part about what the valve does and what becomes briefly available when it opens, that part is as precise as a description of a specific kind of human experience I've read anywhere. The filter is not the self. The self is what the filter has been reducing all along. And what becomes available when the reduction loosens, even if it's just a little bit, it's not wisdom or any of the things the self-industry promises you at the end of the journey. It's just more of what was always there. More of what the valve had been deciding on your behalf and without your consent that you couldn't afford to receive. Arthur Morgan's version of that is the mountain. Mine was a city street at some hour I couldn't remember, with nothing left to perform and no audience left to perform to. Different circumstances, same mechanism. The filter doesn't open because you're ready. It opens because you finally stop being able to afford keeping it shut. That's just what it is. Arthur Morgan dies on a mountain watching the sun rise. He has maybe an hour, his lungs are done. The man who spent his entire adult life performing someone who didn't require anything from the world is sitting there at the end of it, watching light come over a landscape he's crossed 100 times. And the journal entry from that morning is the most unguarded thing he ever wrote. The filter is fully open, because there's nothing left worth maintaining it for. And what comes through is just the experience of being present in a moment without the reduction running, which is something he almost never let himself have while there was still time to have more of it. That's the part that gets me every time. That's the part that actually gets me emotional. Not that he's dying, but that it took dying for the living to finally feel real. That it took running completely out of road before he stopped managing his own experience long enough to just have it. I don't know what my version of that mountain looks like. I know I'm not on it yet. I know the sensation of the filter creeping back on bad days. The pull toward the comfortable numbness of not require anything from anyone. And I know that past tense is an incomplete description of something that still has present tense thief. What I have is a slightly wider aperture than I used to have. And the understanding, not the decision, the understanding, which arrived through depletion rather than choice, that the valve was never protecting me from the world. It was protecting me from the signal the world was sending that I'd decided I couldn't afford to receive. Henry Bergson would say the filter was never the enemy. It was always just the price of functioning. But functioning and living are not the same thing. And most people spend their entire lives optimizing the former without ever asking what the latter might actually feel like, with the valve open just a little wider. Memory is not a reliable narrator when it comes to your own failures. But the filter leaves traces everywhere except in itself, in what you avoided and in what kept finding you anyway. In the journal entries that document everything except the thing that mattered most. Read back to you in a voice that changes depending on who you've been becoming without noticing. The footage is always there. You just have to be willing to watch it.